Right, welcome to latest podcast of Asian Persuaion MMA. We're joined by, as usual, Akhilesh Gannavarapu and Davie, the co-founder of the UFC, who will be inducted to the Hall of Fame in July. We will come to that in a little bit, but first, let's talk about starting out UFC. Tell us more about that. I mean, wow.
Well, you know, I love to tell the story that I got interested in this whole thing because I was training for the Golden Gloves at age 18, and I wasn't very good. And I wound up getting challenged by a high school wrestler to an impromptu match.
Wow.
And we started talking. We were on the beach, and a friend of mine introduced us. And before you know it, we were arguing about whether or not, could a boxer beat a wrestler? Well, before you know it, I got suckered into a match, and I threw a couple of jabs, boom, 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 and they went right over his head. Right over his head. And I tried a hook, and I missed him with the hook. And then he executes a perfect double leg takedown, and now I'm on the beach, on my back, with this Hulk on top of me. And I didn't know what to do. So I wound up submitting. Now, back in the day, there was nothing called a tap out. That came later. But I wound up saying, "Uncle, I'm done." I was lost on the ground. And that really made an impression on me. Now, if you fast forward a couple of years, I'm in the Marines. And I'm in Vietnam. And a couple of my buddies went over to Bangkok for an R&R. And they went and saw a mixed match in a Bangkok nightclub between an Indian wrestler and a Muay Thai kickboxer. When they came back, we started talking about that. We started arguing that. And that, remembering what had happened to me when I was 18 in 1965, I got this idea stuck in my head. I thought to myself, every young guy at some point argues, could Bruce Lee have beaten Muhammad Ali? Right. That was the big debate, right? So that idea stuck in my head. And I tell the story that in 1989, I was taking a bath. And I had this idea that came into my head. And the idea was a single day, single elimination tournament with 8 or 16 fighters. And I saw it on pay-per-view. So we'd have boxers, we'd have wrestlers, we'd have martial artists, and we'd find out who was the real Lord of the Ring. That was the idea. And in the beginning, I was the only believer. I was alone. And I had to figure out how to go out and get this thing up on its legs. But I was a salesman by trade. I made enough money to own a car dealership, a video dating service, a software company, and an ad agency. So I thought, if anybody could sell this, it's me. And that's what it needed. It needed a con man, a hustler, a P.T. Barnum. It needed me. So I sat down and wrote a business plan, 65 pages. And when I sat down and wrote that plan, I really became the creator of the UFC, because everything that was in that plan, people who have read it have told me it all came true in terms of not just the UFC, but MMA in general. It was all in the plan. And in the plan, I talked about that I saw myself as like the promoter in the film King Kong. Everybody sees the giant ape on the beach knocked out, and they're glad that that's over. They want to get back to the ship. And the promoter says, "Boys, this is the 8th wonder of the world. We're going to go and put him up on Broadway in lights. The 8th wonder of the world. It's going to be big." And that's how I felt about the UFC. I said to myself, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. And here I had this tremendous idea. So with writing the plan, when you write a plan, it forces you to think carefully about what you would do to make something happen. You'd figure out, I need this amount of money, I need these resources, I need to recruit these kind of people, this kind of talent. So that plan was my weapon to go out and get this thing started. I knew I would need fighters, and as part of my research, I collected a lot of information. And I tell people, hey, for over 1,000 years, the most popular event in the Greek Olympics was pankration. For for 1,041 years, from 648 BC to 394 AD, until a Roman emperor banned it as being too violent. It was the most popular event in the Greek Olympics. So all I was doing was bringing back the glories, the fighting glory of the ancient world. I knew we would need money, and with the business plan, I went out and got 27 investors, friends of mine, and friends of a man that I met. I needed a fighter, and part of my research, I read an article in a magazine about the Gracie family. And they were willing, their family had a tradition of accepting challenges in Brazil. And when I met Persuaion Gracie in California, he was doing them in the back room of the Gracie Academy. So I went out and met him, and we talked, and I ran this idea by him, but he said to me, Arturo, everybody comes to me with a big idea to make the Gracie Challenge work. And the Gracie Challenge was about, he would put up 100,000 and you put up 100,000, and whoever won would keep all the money. Well, nobody had that kind of money in the martial arts school business. Persuaion had even talked to Benny Urquidez, the great kickboxer, and Benny said to him, I'm not putting up 100,000, but if you win, I'll put up all my belts. And Persuaion said, your belts? I don't need your belts. I got my own belts. I got a red belt from my father, Elio. I don't need your belts. So that's the thing that had killed mixed style fighting. They would argue about the rules. Can I wear a gi? Can I put Vaseline? Can I wear gloves? Are we going to do it on a wrestling mat? Are we going to do it in a boxing ring? And then they'd argue about the money. How much money do I get? How much money do you get? And that would be the argument. Benny would say to Persuaion, hey, I'm more famous than you are. I need to get 70%. You get 30. So most of those things never took place. And the ones that did, like Ali versus Antonio Inoki in 1976 in Japan, they were still arguing about the rules the day before the event. Correct. It was a disaster. Ali only threw 8 punches the whole match, and Inoki stayed almost the whole time on his back, having to kick from the ground. It was a disaster. You know who took a big beating on that in the United States was Vince McMahon Sr.
Yeah.
You know that story?
Yeah, inside the Shea Stadium. Yeah.
He had been willing to do closed circuit promotion of that event in the United States. He staged a comparable event in Shea Stadium in New York.
Yeah.
With Andre the Giant and Chuck Wepner, the famous Bayonne bleeder, who inspired the Rocky films. But he took a bath on that event. Everybody hated it. There was a big buzz. It was terrible. So I was glad I found the Gracies because they were doing it. And when I got in there, I rolled with Persuaion, and I realized I knew nothing on the ground. Not only back in '65, but on the ground with the Gracies, I was like a child, you know. So I kept talking to Persuaion, and I wound up taking classes. Well, the same night that I take a class, who's also taking a private lesson from Persuaion, is film director and screenwriter John Milius. Now, Milius is the guy who made Arnold Schwarzenegger a star in Conan the Barbarian.
Right.
He also wrote most of the script for the Dirty Harry movies and made the Smith & Wesson 44 Magnum a star in that movie. He wrote a lot of the great lines that are in the script Jaws for Steven Spielberg. So I would talk to Milius sometimes after a class, and I would say, John, if I ever come up with anything, would you lend your name to this? He said, absolutely. Yeah, no problem. He said, you can use my name. So between my business plan and finally trying to convince Persuaion, and here's how I convinced Persuaion. I found out that he had come up with a new set of instructional videos, the basics of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And he'd been doing these little teeny ads in Black Belt magazine for the in-action tapes. Some beach fights with his brother down in Brazil, some things in the United States as an introduction. And I said, are you making any money? He said, I'll make a little bit, un poquito, un poco, not a lot. I said, I'll tell you what, I know how to do a direct mail campaign. He said, what's that? We don't do that in Brazil. I said, they call it junk mail in America, but the advertising agency that I went to work for was literally 4 blocks away from the Gracie Academy. I had gone to work for an ad agency that was right in that neighborhood. So I would get off of work, I would go over the academy, I would roll, and I would talk to Horion, and I would talk to John. And then one day I said, I'm going to do this ad campaign free. All right. I said, you pay for the printing and the postage. I'll give you the campaign for free. I was selling the campaign at that time for $10,000, $12,000, the creative. I gave it to him for free. I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote it over Christmas vacation. Gave him the whole thing. Now it brought in $150,000 in 6 weeks. Now I walked in his office and he says, Arturo, what do we do next? I said, now we do that idea that I was telling you about that you never listened to, my tournament on pay-per-view. He said, I'm in, whatever you want to do. So I had gone up, I had done research. I knew that Colorado had a loophole in the law. We could do bare knuckle fighting. They had done the Sabaki Challenge up there, the bare knuckle championship. And I found out also it was a good state to form a limited liability company, LLC, here in America. And the LLC was perfect because if an investor gave you $10,000 and someone got hurt or you got sued for big money, for $1 million, their only obligation was the $10,000 that they had put up. So it was perfect for the investors. That's all they were risking. So between that, the 27 investors, now I got to go out and get us a TV partner. And Horion said, what are you going to do? I said, leave it up to me. I'm the salesman. I'll go out. I'm true believer number 1. I said, you're true believer number 2. I said, I'll go out and get somebody in TV. I got turned down by HBO. I got turned down by Showtime. I got turned down by ESPN. But I found Semaphore Entertainment Group, and they were doing concerts and comedy on pay-per-view. They had no franchise. Because how many times a year can you bring a comedian to pay-per-view? Maybe once. Andrew Dice Clay. Once that year. They had no franchise. So when I went in to see them, I said, this is going to be bigger than wrestling. And I told Bob Marowitz, the owner of the company, I said, you're going to be a big shot like Don King. He bought it. He decided to put up money, and I found out that they were getting funding from one of the biggest entertainment companies on the planet in Europe. They were being funded by Bertelsmann's Music Group, BMG. Anybody and everybody in the music business, including Michael Jackson, has in some case worked for BMG. They're that big. At that time, they were the largest privately held entertainment company on earth. When I found out that they were the ones writing the checks, I said, oh, we got real money here. We're gonna do big business. So I convinced them that we should do the event in Colorado. We had looked at doing it in Brazil, too complicated, especially for the first one. And then it was my job to recruit the fighters. I put ads in magazines, black belt, inside karate, inside kung fu in the United States. And in those days, there was no internet, but there was faxes. I was sending faxes to everybody on the planet. Holland, Amsterdam, Thailand, Japan, South America. I was sending, if you had a karate organization, if you had a kickboxing school, if you were a sanctioning body of any type, you got a fax from me, and then I phone called you. And everybody would say to me, is this a movie? Are you looking for actors to be in a movie? I said, no. This is the real deal. This is the real Kumite. I'm bringing back pankration. Everybody thought it was a movie. Most people simply said, that's crazy. You're crazy. They would hang up. I wasn't discouraged. I was on a mission from God. I was like, that line in the Blues Brothers movie, we're on a mission from God. That was me. So I kept going. And I had 2 crazy ideas. Number 1, I wanted a sumo wrestler. And most of the martial arts people I knew said, what do you want a sumo wrestler for? I said, can you imagine a 400-pound sumo wrestler picking up a guy with a karate black belt and throwing him out of the ring? I said, fans are going to want to see that. And besides, I said, they're going to want to see every martial art from A to Z, from Aikido, to Taekwondo. They want to see them all. I said, I'm going to put a boxer in. And some of the funniest phone calls was me calling up the boxing gyms. I called up the Kronk gym in Detroit, the famous Emmanuel Stewart when he was alive. It took me weeks to get him on the phone. He said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to get a heavyweight or a cruiserweight pro boxer and put him in this tournament. He'd be fighting a karate champion or a judo black belt. He said, you want to get a pro boxer to fight those guys in karate pajamas? karate pajamas. He said, "You're nuts." He said, "Whatever you're drinking," he said, "you ought to share it with me because I want to be as stoned as you are." And he hung up. I couldn't get Dan Gable on the phone at the University of Iowa. I wanted a top wrestler. I tried to get his assistant, Tom Brand. Boom. Everybody hanging up on me. Nobody wanted to talk to me. But I kept going. I finally recruited 8 fighters and 2 alternates, 4 kickboxers, a shoot fighter, a sumo wrestler, and my heavyweight boxer. And my boxer was due to fight Tommy Hitman Hearns 6 weeks after the first UFC. So he was worried about, could anything get broken? And you know who screwed that up? Big John McCarthy. The week of the event, we had everybody over at the gyms, the Gold's Gym, the World Gym. I had Tiger Kim's gym over on Colfax Avenue, a good kickboxing gym. And McCarthy went over there one day, and there's Jimison working on the speed bag, boom, boom, boom. He's working on the heavy bag. And he says to McCarthy, he says, "Aren't you with those jiu-jitsu guys?" McCarthy had come there to be a big guy for Horion to work with, because Horion knew I was starting to bring in big guys who were going to weigh 300 pounds, maybe 400 pounds. My sumo wrestler weighed 420. So he and McCarthy got on the mat, and they rolled. And McCarthy took him down, mounted him, put his big fist in his face. He said, "Now what are you going to do?" And Jimison started to shake. He said, "They're going to break my arm, aren't they?" He said, McCarthy said, "Yeah, they could." After that, Jimison was done. He wanted to go home. I was still talking him into the event on Friday morning. He wanted to get back on the plane. We had paid him an appearance fee. He wanted to go home. So I was determined to get these people in and make it happen. And that week was exciting because nobody knew what it was going to be like. Nobody had ever done this before, really. Not on TV. And the fighters meeting on Thursday night, that was where the drama started. Because I had said to Horion, you're going to become the King Midas of the martial arts. So why don't we say that you're going to be the commissioner of the International Fighting Council? And McCarthy was there with the Gracie. He wasn't a referee at this point. That came in UFC 2. So I got up and explained the rules and so forth. And then Horion started to talk about the knuckle wraps, about wrapping the knuckle. And he said, well, you can't wrap the knuckle itself. You could wrap an inch back from the knuckle. Well, the boxer stood up. He's complaining, Jimison. He said, I got to wrap my hands. I don't want to break my fist. And Zane Fraser, the kickboxer, at that time, he was the super heavyweight champion of the International Kickboxing Federation. He stands up and says, hey, we were told that there's no rules. So why is there a big issue about this? Now, the whole room starts a big argument. Everybody's waving their hands and standing up. And then I see Rickson Gracie stand up. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Rickson Gracie stands up, and he's standing right behind Zane Fraser. And then Fraser, a very bright guy, spoke very well, very good talker. He's starting an argument with Rickson. And I see the director, Mark Lucas, over on the other side of the room going like this to me. Cut this off. Get these guys. So you know who saves me? The sumo wrestler, Taylor Wiley, who plays Kamakona on the TV show in America called Hawaii Five-0. He comes in with his brothers and his cousin. He's in the back of the room. He stands up, and I had given everybody a release to sign in which they understood the rules. And it said, you know, you could be injured, and you're waiting any rights to that. You understand. He stands up. He has signed the paper. He stands up. He says, I don't know about the rest of you, but I'll be there tomorrow night. Anybody wants to party? I'll see you there. And he slams the paper down on the table. The whole room got quiet. The argument were over. In fact, the Gracies started to applaud. I see Rickson applauding. I was like, great. That killed the whole thing. Because I was worried that night that would happen. We would have a brawl. The cops would show up. There'd be no event Friday night. So that's the story of the first UFC.
And I also wanted to ask you this, because you said when you called people up, they asked if it was legal. Even Chuck Norris, if I remember correctly, asked you if it was legal. That's the entire premise of your book.
Yes. In fact, the funny story on Chuck Norris was Horion Gracie and Chuck knew each other. Okay. They had done some joint seminars together, and Chuck had taken some jiu-jitsu lessons at the Gracie Academy. He and Horion, though, were arguing about what he was paying Horion to come in and do some grappling seminars. And Horion said, well, that number that you quote me, well, that's just for me. What about my brothers? And Chuck said, wait a minute. That $5,000 is for everybody. You got to make that work. So they were not happy with each other. So when I said to Persuaion, I said, what about if I asked Chuck to be a commentator? And if he doesn't want to be a commentator, just sit there by the octagon and wave at the camera. So Persuaion and I went over to Chuck's house together. True story. It's in the book. And we got to the house, and Persuaion says to me, Arturo, look, he said, let me go in first and talk to Chuck, and let me smooth out that whole thing about the seminars. And, you know, it's a money issue. He and I shake hands, and we put that out of the way. I'll come right out to the car, and I'll bring you in and pitch him. So I'm sitting there for 20 minutes, and I'm by myself. Nobody's coming. Finally, ready to honk the horn. Who comes out of the house but Persuaion? I said, what are you doing? I said, ready to go? He said, no. He said, Chuck doesn't like the whole idea. What do you mean? He said, every time I brought something up, I said, what did you bring up? He said, well, you gave me a card with all the bullet points of this tournament. It was like 7 or 8 things. He said, every time Chuck would say to me, well, what is it? He said, I'd read one of those points, and Chuck would say, is this legal? I said, how many times did he say, is this legal? He said it 6 times. I said, he's not coming. And he didn't want me to bring you in. He says, I'm done. It's not for me. So that's the story of Chuck Norris. Now, years later, I'm at his house, and it's in the blog. And I TV show that No Fear. It was years later, I'm at his house, and we're talking about this TV show. And Chuck said to me, he said, I want to make an announcement in front of a room full of people. He said, you know, I was wrong about the UFC 11 years ago. He said, I want to apologize to you. I thought that was really classy. He didn't have to say that. And we shook hands. It was just really wonderful. I never sold him the TV show. He wanted too much money. I wanted him to star in the show. It was just too much money. I couldn't get Fox TV to buy it. So that's the whole story with Chuck Norris. But most people thought it was crazy. Everybody said to me, we're not going to do that. You have to remember, back in the day, nobody was fighting professionally. Kickboxing downgrade. Boxing had a high, and then it's on the downgrade in the United States. Now in Europe, out of there, they were fighting in Thailand or Japan, and they had a lot of Ernesto Hoops, Peter Arts, Andy Hoog, going over and fighting in Japan. I called up the 2 biggest gyms in Holland, Johan Klaas's gym and Tom Harring's Ricky gym, and I was able to get Gerard Gordeau. He provides a lot of hustle for the brothel owners and the nightclub owners. He's a tough guy on the street, and he's a tough guy in the room. So I brought him in. So I was fortunate to get him because he knew leg kicks. In America, they weren't leg kicks. America was retarded. We're not doing leg kicks.
Right, and also I wanted to ask you this because it was Donald Trump that actually gave UFC a home when it really started to pick up, and you were roommates with the current president of the United States. Were there any signs where you kind of thought he was interested in combat sports at that point?
Well, you know, the funny story is Don and I were roommates for 1 semester in the early 1960s, 62 through 63. And we weren't close friends. Don, by the way, was a very good baseball player. He was the star first baseman, and he later became the captain of the team. But I never ran into him again, ever. So the funny story was we were roommates when we were kids. He was 16 and I was 15.
Okay.
And we were together until January of 63. But I've never met him since then. And I'll bet he doesn't really know that I am the creator and co-founder of the UFC. Maybe after the Hall of Fame he will. I don't know. Who knows?
How much have you followed UFC's progress over the years? I mean, it must have been amazing for you to see how big it's grown.
Well, you know, we thought at the time, though, that it was going to be huge. And I'll tell you why. Again, the example of pankration being the biggest sport for 1,000 years in the Olympics. And John Milius was our advisor. And John wouldn't take any pay. I gave him a box of Cuban cigars, and I hired his son as my PA, my production assistant, Ethan. So that was all we ever did for John. But John used to say to me, Arturo, he said, this is going to be huge. He said, you're bringing back the glory of the ancient world. He said, at some point in the future, there'll be 50 million people watching this one night on television or something, maybe through the computers. He said, that's where it's going. He predicted that in 1993. So all of us thought that this was a big opportunity. Remember that when we signed a deal with Semaphore, it was a 5-year deal. Now, when Zuffa bought it in 2001, they made some statements that, it was a one-shot. It was just done as a one-time spectacle. That wasn't true. In fact, there's even some of the agreement in my book, the language from the agreement showing that it was a 5-year deal. They wanted to do this for 5 years and then renew it. And we were planning on doing it 3 times the first year, 4 or 5 times the second year, 6 or 7 times the third. And by 1997, that's what we were doing. So it kept getting bigger. But as I pointed out in the book, and as I pointed out in interviews, right from the very beginning, the politicians and the media started to attack it. It was too violent. They considered it brutal. Senator McCain from Arizona, who later ran for president, called it human cockfighting. And it seemed like every city we went to, it got tougher to do it. By the time we went to Charlotte for UFC 5, we were hiring civil attorneys and criminal attorneys to keep the show going. When we went to Detroit, the judge ruled that there could be no closed fist punching. We could do the event, but only slap fights. And Bob Meyerowitz agreed to that. McCarthy was in the room. I was there. And the judge said, I'll let this event go Friday night, but no closed fist punching. So I was told by Bob Meyerowitz, he said, well, you better fine everybody if they punch. And I had brought in Mark Schultz, the Olympic gold medalist, at the last minute to fight Gary Goodrich. He threw 41 unanswered punches, closed fist. I was supposed to fine him more than $4,000. I never collected the fines. The night of the fight, we went around to the dressing room, John McCarthy and I, and John said, I got a big announcement to make. Listen, Art. I was the commissioner then. Okay. And I said to everybody, if you punch, I'm going to fine you $100 for every punch. Do you understand that? Everybody nodded. But a lot of guys punched. And the problem with the super fight was that Severin had announced on radio he was going to punch. He had done a radio interview. So I'm going to punch anyway. He was fighting Shamrock in a super fight. When Shamrock heard that, he said, I can't do that. He said, the people from Sports Illustrated are here this week interviewing me, and they're telling me that I am a role model for kids. He said, I can't punch. So 2 hours before the fight, he's not over at the arena. He's in his hotel room with his wife and his father, and he's upset. In fact, when I got there, he was crying. He said, I'm not fighting. He said, I'm not fighting. He said, Severin's going to punch. I'm not punching. I'm not going. So Bob and I walked out. We said, whatever you're going to do, we can't make you fight. What are we going to do, hold a gun on you? No. But he decided at the last minute. So we did that event. Monday morning, the newspapers reported that the judge called up the police department and they issued a warrant for me. They wanted to arrest me. And the UFC didn't come back to Detroit until last fall.
Right.
Last November.
Correct.
It was when they came back December 1st. They came back to the UFC for the first time in more than 20 years. It's wild. It's wild.
And do you think right now there's any promotion that's going to be big enough to challenge UFC because of how many years they've been doing this, how much money they have? Do you think there can be an organization that can compete with the UFC?
That's a very good question. I would have to say my first answer to that would be that, when you're that dominant as a brand, and now that's 25 years, right? And they've generated a lot of income. They lost money. Zuffa lost money until 2006. Right. And then with the second season of The Ultimate Fighter, they finally had the formula, which always worked in wrestling. You have a weekly TV show, and you bring your stars over to pay-per-view. So they started to really make money in 2006. So today it would take a tremendous amount of capital to challenge the UFC. On the other hand, I'm old enough. I'm 71. I'm old enough to remember when Sperry Rand was the biggest computer company in America, and IBM, and there was no Apple. Yeah. Apple today is one of the biggest corporations on the planet. So, things can change. At one time there was a place called Blockbuster Video in America where you could rent videos. They're gone. Right. So things do change. And I got to tell you something. My prediction is in 10 to 15 years, MMA will be the biggest sport on the planet. On the planet. Bigger than soccer. Why? Everyone loves a good fight. And MMA is the first sport there is. It'll be bigger than any other sport. Why? Remember that they're now getting involved in the Middle East. India, the home of the martial arts. now has MMA promotion. I'm sending some of my books to India. I have people writing me and wanting an autographed copy of my book who live in Delhi and Mumbai. And remember that India is the true home of the martial arts before it ever got to Asia, before it ever got to China and Japan. It's India. And now you see what China's doing. So to answer your question, I think that when you see what's happening now within Russia, right, with what the big promotion they have there out of St. Petersburg, ONE FC in Shanghai and Beijing, you see what's happening in the Middle East with Desert Force, I think that we're going to see this sport continue to grow worldwide. And remember, young men and women all over the world really like it when they go to it. And I think it's become as or more popular than Formula One racing and more popular than football. What we call soccer, and the rest of the world calls football. I think that's where it's going. Wait and see. My prediction.
You mentioned there about 25 years. Obviously, the UFC turns 25 this year. You're going to be inducted to the Hall of Fame. Tell us what that means to you.
You know, I've finished my speech. They wanted to see my speech before I give it. And in writing my speech, I had a lot of fun because I got a chance to tell the true inside story, the keyhole story of what really happened. And I wanted to give a lot of credit to a lot of people. I give a lot of credit to Zuffa in the speech. I give a lot of credit to John McCarthy. You know, McCarthy was the guy who was one of the first people to understand that it needed to evolve from a spectacle and become a sport.
Right.
We used to, whenever we were brought into court, McCarthy was there as the referee explaining the new rules, which I had written, but McCarthy really wrote most of those rules. So I give a lot of credit in the speech. And I mentioned in the beginning of the speech, I said, you know, I'm here because it's time, the right time. I'm here because it's the right time. And I give a lot of credit to the UFC for acknowledging me as the creator and the co-founder in their press release. And a lot of fans who might not know who I am now will know who I am because the UFC has said, this is the guy who was the creator and the co-founder. And for that, I thank them.
Right.
Absolutely.
And do you think this is your legacy? What UFC is, the brand itself. Is that your legacy for you?
You know, I really do. You have to remember that I was a salesman for all of my life, but I did a lot of selling in the advertising business. And when you're in advertising, your job is to create sales for a company on their product or service, and that's how they pay their mortgage. That's how they put their kids through school. That's how they put food on the table. So my job was always to increase customers, to increase sales, and to people could then pay their rent, pay their bills. So when I look at the UFC today and I see that there are people in India and people in Jakarta and people in Thailand and people in Norway and people in Buenos Aires, and they're writing it, and they're in clothing companies and they're promoting and they're fighting amateur and pro. I see that this thing continues to grow. My legacy is that I was able to start something. My idea, my brainchild has grown and has gone worldwide. It's gone viral. For me, that's as good as it gets.
Fantastic. So I also wanted to ask you about XARM, the new promotion that you began combining kickboxing and arm wrestling. How did that come about?
Well, you know, the funny story on XARM was it wasn't my idea. I got a call from a friend of mine who's a producer in LA, and he said, there's a big TV production company in Seattle, Washington. They do a lot of work with Microsoft. They do a lot of work with Starbucks coffee up in Seattle. And he said they were having lunch one day, and they were joking about the fact that if you were arm wrestling, what about if you reached across the table and punched them? So they got talking about it, and they got having some fun with this idea. And then after lunch, they said, you know, this might be a really good idea. So they started to call friends of theirs in LA. And they called this producer, who was a friend of mine, and they said to him, who would you recommend to help us with this? Because we can't build this. We don't know how. He said, well, if you want to make it a spectacle, he said, I can introduce you to Hulk Hogan.
Okay.
Wrestler. He said, if you want to make it a sport, I'll introduce you to Art Davie, because he made UFC a sport, became MMA. So they called me up, we met, and I found out they had capital to do this. And they said, we want to give you all the resources to do this. What will you do? I said, well, I'll hold some tryouts. I'll hold some workshops. And I'll bring some people in. We'll write a rule book, and we'll see if it can work. And we'll test it. We'll build a table. And we did. and we tested it. We got funding from Ripe TV. We got funding from machinima.com, the game. We got funding to build an X-Arm game from the people who do. I'm trying to think of it's a big company in Holland, and they gave us the money for the game.
Okay.
They gave us the money for the game. They gave us $500,000 to build an X-Arm game. So we were well funded, but when we tested it, it didn't test out as well as we thought, number one. And when I went to talk to people in TV that I knew about bringing it on the cable, everyone said the same thing to me. Art, what you did with the UFC, there was a reservoir of talent to draw from. The karate schools were full of people studying karate, the kung fu schools, the taekwondo schools, the judo players, the wrestlers. There was plenty of people to bring in. No one has done this sport. You've invented this sport from the ground up, so there's no place for them to do this before they ever come to you. There's no base. There's no resource base. And that was the biggest objection that the TV people had. They said it's kind of a gimmick in that way. So after 4 years, we pulled the plug.
Okay.
We pulled the plug. Yeah. But
Do you still follow now?
What's that?
Do you still follow now the UFC cards each week?
Yeah, I do. I do. I take a look at it. I've gotten more interested in it the last year. I spent more time watching Bellator for a while because Sean Wheelock, who was my editor on the book, was their play-by-play guy for many years. Yeah. Jimmy Smith, who's now with the UFC, his wife did a great video of me that she submitted to ESPN. So I used to watch Bellator quite a bit. There's only been 4 guys, in my opinion, that were really talented at creating stars in MMA. Saka Karaba in Japan with Pride, Bjorn Rebney with Bellator, Dana White, and Art Davie. So when you get right down to it, all of us who were in the business of creating stars, I think are the guys who really are the father of the sport in general. And I'm very proud about the fact that 8 or 9 out of the guys in the Pioneer Wing were guys that I recruited. And right. Horion brought in Hoyce, so I really can't claim Hoyce. I wanted Hickson, by the way, as you know. I wanted Hickson. I didn't get him. But he wanted to put his little brother in. But I brought in Ken Shamrock. And Shamrock, a guy from his school, called me, saw an ad in Black Belt Magazine, Scott Basak. Scott called me up and he said, Mr. Davie, I want to go into this. I said, all right. So we talked for about 30 minutes. Finally, he said, you know what? He said, you know who should do this? He said, my coach, my teacher, my trainer, Ken Wayne Shamrock. I love that name. That's a name that belongs on a billboard, Ken Wayne Shamrock. I said, have him call me. And Ken was over in Japan starting to do pancrase. Yeah. So he was the last fighter for the first week of UFC 1. He didn't get there till Tuesday. Everybody else came Sunday or Monday. He was doing a pancrase in Fukuoka on Saturday. He didn't get to Denver until Tuesday morning. Wednesday, I see him in the garage. And he's still asking me the same question. He says, Mr. Davie, is this for real? Ken, we've been through this on the phone 3 times. He said, in the promotion business, you talk about a work or a shoot. You guys know that term, right? Yeah. Work and a shoot. So Wednesday morning, Ken is saying to me, he said, Art, he said, can I call you Art? I said, of course. He said, Art, he said, this isn't a work. I said, we've been through this. There's some guy here in karate pajamas I know has never had a real fight. He was talking about Hoyce. I saw him in the gym. He said, he's never had a real fight. He said, he's a kid. He's wearing the karate, the pajamas, the judo jacket. He thought this. So the first time that I think he really got convinced, we had set up a big monitor in the dressing area over at the arena. And everybody saw that first fight between Gerard Gordeau and Taylor Wiley. And Gordeau, that kick went to the mouth. Yeah. 2 of his teeth were in the foot. He broke his hand, hitting him with the right. And everybody back in the dressing area, everybody got quiet. Mark Lucas, the director, said, Art, he said, everybody's face, the blood drained from everybody's face. They realized this wasn't bullshit. This is real. And I understand the Shamrock turned to his people and said, okay, it's a shoot. It's a shoot.
Oh, fantastic. So, Art, I just also want to get your thoughts on what it means for you, because the business, as you said, it's growing. In the next 10 to 15 years, MMA is going to be the biggest sport. What does being the guy that started all of this mean to you?
Well, like you asked me before about the legacy, and I think that's the biggest part of it. I feel a tremendous connection with it because it was my baby. When I wrote the book, it was a great opportunity for me to remember all that I went through. Remember, it took me 4 years, really, from the time I first thought of it, and I presented it to an ad client, and they thought it was crazy. So I had all these files. So it took a total of 4 years before we ever got it on TV. So my working as long as I did and finally making it happen was a great feeling of accomplishment. I didn't do it really for the money. The money was frosting on the cake. For me, being able to do this, being able to prove I could do it, and being able to take what had been a dangerous idea, a wild idea that everybody said was crazy. I had to be the first believer. I had to convince everybody else. I did that. So I have a great sense of pride about that. The book has been a great thrill for me. And now the book has been optioned as a film.
Yeah.
And my producer called me this morning, and he's telling me that both William Morris Endeavor, which represents him and owns the UFC, they're all excited about it. The script has been sent to all the big producers to join with my producer to do this. It's going out to all the A-list actors. And the two writers are from UTA, and they got even more excited about it. They've already sent it to Chris Pratt, whose agent read the book and loved it, and Chris is reading it, and he says he loves it. So I don't know who's finally going to be in the movie and what studio is finally going to package this. But I have a feeling you're going to hear some news about this in the next 1 or 2 months.
And who's going to be playing Art Davie? Who do you want to play Art Davie?
Well, I'll be honest with you. My favorite would be, and my producer sent him the book and the script, Robert Downey Jr.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He sent him the book and the script. He's not represented by William Morris, and the big problem with him will be, is he available? Between the Avengers movies and the Iron Man movies, sure. He's booked up, On the other hand, he won an Academy Award nomination for playing Chaplin. Right. He's a good actor. He's not just an action star. He's a good actor. And I got to tell you, the script that has been written, it's so good. It's a drama. The Gracies, the fighters, me, Bob Meyerowitz, Kathy Kidd, Clay McBride, the characters. It's a whole soap opera. It really is. And it's a good story. And it all ends up that night, November 12th, 1993. And then the after-fight party on the 13th, where everybody dressed up in tuxedos and put masks on and came to the event. And we all partied the whole night. I was still leading a conga line at 4 o'clock in the morning with two of the great kids behind me, and Taylor Wiley with a Hawaiian skirt on and a T-shirt and a bow tie that Gerard Gordeau had given him with his eye bandaged. So, I mean, it was, those after-fight parties, there was a great sense of camaraderie. Those guys were doing it for the pride and the love of fighting and being in the UFC. Today, the purses have gotten much fatter, and you could argue that maybe today's fighter does it more for the money. Those guys were doing it for pride and glory. And those guys were, it was an 8-man competition. You had to beat 3 guys in one night to win, to be the champ. And you didn't find out who you were going to fight until the night before at the fighters meeting. You couldn't train for one guy. I mean, you talk about balls. Those guys were brave. I've said in my speech, I said, were they the best fighters on the planet at the time? Not really. There were better guys. I couldn't get them. But they were among the bravest men who stepped up and said yes when everybody else said no. True story.
I want to ask you maybe to finish with, do you see any changes that need to be made in MMA to make it to go to that next level? Or is it just a case it's going to naturally keep growing and growing as it has done?
Well, I point out even in my speech, I said by UFC 2, by bringing McCarthy in, we started to add rules. By UFC 15, I had written 5 rule books. And McCarthy and Jeff Blatnick wrote a lot of those rules. They wrote 85% of them. I wrote the other 15%. So that was a big change. But I'll tell you the other change. Starting in UFC 3, the fighters started to cross-train.
Right.
I remember that Kimo Leopoldo showed up at the Gracie Academy after he lost to Hoyce in UFC 3, and he asked for jiu-jitsu lessons from Horian. Horian turned him down. I said, why'd you turn him down? He said, we're not going to help the enemy. I said, he's not the enemy. He's your best. He's going to be your best advertisement.
Right.
He wants to go and learn the thing to beat him. I said, everyone in the world is going to want to have to learn jiu-jitsu. Don't fight that. So early on, to answer your question, it was the fighters who started to change it from a spectacle to a sport. We were following with the pressure from the politicians and the media. in changing the rules. But the fighters themselves were starting to say, wait a minute, I can't just kick and punch. I got to know the sprawl. I got to know a single and a double leg takedown. I got to be able to throw a Muay Thai kick to the quadricep. These guys were cross-training, and it never stopped. And all the bright ones did that. The dumb ones said, well, I'm still going to do what I do. Great, you're going to lose. And you did. The funny things about, I get a kick out of it, is that sometimes I would get these applications from people who must have read too many martial arts magazines. You know, their hands were deadly weapons. They learned the death touch, you know. I got one application from a guy who called himself the Monk. And he took a picture of himself standing in Alaska, standing in an icy river with the mountains and snow behind him, doing kind of a Wing Chun thing, you know. And his face was visible with the Wing Chun, and he called himself the Monk, and he said he was a former Green Beret, Special Forces. I sent him a ticket. I said, you're in. I'm putting you in. He never showed up. Cashed the ticket. He never showed up. So there were a lot of guys who at the last minute chickened out. You know, they talk good, and then when they finally had to come. So I always give a lot of credit to the guys who came and fought. You had to have guts. You were facing a guy you didn't even know who you were going to fight until the day before. And how am I going to adapt? This guy does this. I don't know that. How am I going to, you know, these guys had to think on their feet. They had to be willing to put their reputations on the line. Because I said the other reason why the mixed style fighting had never worked. Because if you owned a school in a town, Amsterdam, Delhi, Brooklyn, New York, you didn't challenge the guy on the other side of town in a public fight. Why? If you did and you lost, you'd lose students. It would kill your business. And these guys were making a living running a school. They were putting food on the table. They weren't becoming millionaires. So by creating a tournament with a grand prize and money at every level and no rules, what I did was to finally send out a call. I was like the Pied Piper. I was blowing on the come on and follow me. It's a crusade. Come on, I would say to them. Get in here. Show who you are. Have balls. Be a man. And I have all these people follow me. And a lot of them didn't. And it was the ones who did that I have a lot of respect for. More respect today than I did back then. Because now I know more than ever what it took.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. It's been brilliant to talk to you. We've loved hearing your stories. We look forward to seeing you be inducted to the Hall of Fame, and really looking forward to your film when it comes out. With Robert Downey Jr., hopefully.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the support. I always tell people, if you go to www.isthislegalthebook.com, you can buy the book either plain or autographed. And keep your eye out. I think we're going to have an announcement sometime in the next 6 to 8 weeks that there's going to be an announcement about a film, and we're all excited about that. But I always tell people, too, it took 10 years to make Forrest Gump.
Right.
Forrest Gump stayed in Hollywood for 10 years. It was there. Everybody said it's a good script. It eventually won Best Picture of the Year, and it won Tom Hanks a Best Actor award. But it took 10 years to make. So I don't know how long it will take to get this movie in the theaters. But I think it's going to get made. I think the script is so good. And the producer, his last two films, our producer, both the actors were nominated for Best Actor in his last two movies. So we've got a good team together, and the agencies are very big on it, both William Morris and UTA. I'm hearing a lot of excitement over there, and I'm hearing some big names of producers, big names, that have read the script and are saying, we want a meeting with my producer and with the writers. In fact, there's 2 meetings taking place this week, Tuesday and Wednesday of this week in Los Angeles. So everything's moving forward. Hopefully I'll have some good news for you guys. I really enjoyed talking to you guys. It's a pleasure. And believe me, it's you guys in India and in Indonesia and Thailand that are proving that MMA is a world-class event. Look at you guys. You're not here in America. I'm in Nevada. You guys are in Asia. There's the proof that this sport has got legs, and it's going to get bigger.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, it's an honor and a pleasure to talk to you about the origins of UFC. And I'm pretty sure we'll stay in touch. We'll get you on the show once again pretty soon. And
I would like to come back. I would like to come back. And it looks like Skype worked pretty well tonight. I'm glad to hear that for all of us.
Perfect.
All right,
absolutely.
Guys, you take care and stay well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.